Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. We are going to be covering supervision tactics and self-care strategies for youth peer support staff. This is presented by the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, Region 10's Portland State University. My name is Caitlin Baird, and I have Maria Hermson and Mary Beth Welch with me. In just a moment, we'll go through introductions. If you could please keep your phones on mute as we are going through the presentation, that would be fantastic. And if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the question box or the chat box. You'll also notice that there has been a chat sent to all attendees. This is a link to sign up to the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center's newsletter. Their first newsletter will be coming out next month. It's very exciting, and there's always going to be a lot of fun resources there, including stuff like this. So I hope that you access it. Our agenda for today. So we'll start with introductions, and then we'll review our learning objectives. We'll cover supervision for youth peer support specialists, coaching for youth peer support specialists, creating a culture of self-care, and we'll also be covering vicarious trauma and burnout. So, as I mentioned earlier, my name is Caitlin Baird. I'm a project manager and trainer with Pathways Research and Training Center at Portland State University. I have experience working directly with transition-age youth and young adults as a peer support specialist and as a supervisor for peer support specialists in wraparound and other mental health settings. I'm also a wraparound and systems of care trainer. And now I'm going to hand it over to my other presenters to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Maria Hermson. I'm a research assistant here with Pathways at Portland State University, and I have experience providing peer support for transition-age youth and supervising youth peer support specialists, as well as managing a youth drop-in center program.
Hi everyone, I'm Mary Beth Welch. I'm a peer support training specialist with Pathways RTC, also through PSU. I use my lived experience as a youth in the foster care, mental health, and special education systems to kind of inform my work, along with my experience as a peer support specialist who worked with youth as they were transitioning to adulthood from foster care.
Excellent. Thank you both. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Whoops. So our learning objectives for today. So we're hoping that after today's webinar, you'll have an understanding of how to supervise youth peers in their unique role and how that might look different from traditional supervision, understand the kinds of coaching and support that a youth peer might need, understand how to talk about self-care openly and help create a self-care plan, and understand how to recognize and address vicarious trauma and burnout.
Okay, so let's jump into supervision and what's different about supervising youth peer support specialists. So in this section, we're going to cover appropriate accommodations and flexibility, accountability, setting long and short-term goals, and professional development. Okay, appropriate accommodations and flexibility. So youth peers have lived experience, meaning that they have been impacted by a mental health struggle or a child or young adult serving system in some way. So it's important to recognize that there will be triggering moments in their work and that supervisors are supportive and accommodating. So that's just saying that, we all bring our own experiences to our work, but youth peer support specialists specifically have their own set of lived experiences that they're not only bringing to their work, but they're specifically using in their work, so it's important for supervisors to be cognizant of that when they're supporting them. So some examples of agency policies that could be accommodations for youth peer support specialists would be flexible work schedules. That includes things like understanding that youth peer support specialists are working with youth, so youth are going to be getting off school at 3 p.m., so youth peer support specialists aren't going to be working a traditional 9-to-5 schedule, as well as they might need flexible time off to go to therapy appointments, for example. adequate time off, sick days for mental health days specifically, equitable pay and hours with other professionals, and self-care plans. And we reviewed this extensively in our previous webinar, and there's a link to that here. Okay. What are appropriate accommodations? So, like I said before, allowing youth peers to work on traditional hours, allowing them to flex their hours in order to attend therapy or other appointments, allowing them to work from home when needed, and allowing youth peers to use technology to participate in meetings, supervision, etc.
And something that we want to cover is that agencies should really be supporting these policies, not just for youth peers, but for all of their staff, in order to reduce some of the stigma around peer support work. So a good example, when we talk about having time off specifically for mental health days, it's important that people are really open about that they're taking a mental health day in order to serve themselves, rather than maybe doing what I think some of us have seen, where people might fake a sick day or a vacation day. So really, these accommodations are also about creating a supportive culture.
Right. Okay, accountability. So when we're talking about providing these accommodations, it doesn't mean that we are kind of coddling the youth peers or babying them. We're still holding them accountable to their role and treating them as professionals. So it doesn't mean that we are, letting them shirk their responsibilities. So if we're noticing that they're not performing their duties, you're going to check in, but with a trauma-informed mindset. So this means avoiding assumptions about what's going on, asking for their perspective, checking in about how you can support them, and disciplinary action when it's necessary. So you will want to start off from more of a coaching mindset than necessarily a disciplinary one. So instead of, when you notice a youth peer support specialist is coming in late to work, for example, you might want to frame it in an observational way instead of a punitive way, using open-ended prompts to check in, for instance. I noticed you canceled our last 3 supervision meetings. Do you want to talk about that? And kind of give the youth peer support specialist the chance to explain their perspective before making any assumptions about what's going on. Okay, so these are some tips. Open the conversation. Be transparent about, your concerns and why, this is affecting the agency or the youth you're serving. Ask questions, kind of try to drill down on what the problem is and see how you can support the youth peer to change the behavior. And then work together to make a plan. And this could include both self-care and professional. And then make a plan to follow up. And I always, when I was supervising youth peers, like to put this down in writing and also include a timeline that, we're going to check in within, say, 30 days or 90 days and see how our plan has worked. If it's not working, what are we going to do from here? Goal setting. Okay, so it's important as a supervisor of youth peer support specialists that you're working with them to set goals, and this could be goals related to their job in the agency or continuing outside of the agency. And goals should be SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time limited.
Something that we like to highlight as well as folks who have both been youth peer support specialists and supervisors of youth peer support specialists is it can be very easy for young adults to sort of feel, I think, a little bit confused about where they might go after doing this role. This is a unique role where there's sort of an expiration date on it, right? Because a lot of youth peer support specialists are young people or near peers who are working with youth and young adults. So it's really important that when you're goal setting, you're sort of looking beyond to what are their long-term goals, as Maria mentioned, either within or outside of the organization, and thinking about how can your agency support that. So is that through extra training, CEUs, education opportunities, things of that nature?
This is a nice form that a lot of supervisors and youth peer support specialists that we've worked with have really liked using, and it just kind of helps lay out both those short-term goals and long-term goals and what the supervisor can do to support the youth peer support specialist in that and what steps they can take.
Absolutely. And if you all are interested in accessing this tool, please feel free to follow up with us afterwards. We call this the Learning Practice Agreement, and a lot of people have reported really enjoying using it, and it holds not only the staff accountable, but supervisors accountable to how they say they're going to support their staff members.
So like Caitlin covered, professional development is important for a youth peer support specialist and a supervisor to talk about. One thing that's important to highlight is that for a lot of youth peer support specialists, this is their first job or their first professional job in this kind of setting. So they might need help learning some of the skills that go into working in like a mental health clinical setting, and that could include things like time management, professional dress, and effective communication skills, especially when it comes to interfacing with other community partners and things of that nature. So like Caitlin said, you want to help them with finding and completing other continued training opportunities related to their role and related to their goals, and help them to plan for where they want their career to take them after their time as a youth peer support specialist.
Exactly. And some of these professional development topics will likely come up in your coaching. I know something that when I first started working as a youth peer that I received feedback on, and then a little bit of coaching, is how to draft a professional email. I think sometimes when we're communicating and we're not in person, maybe we come off as a little curt. Jokes don't exactly land the way that you want them to. So that's just an example of something that you might be working on with youth peer support specialists.
So supervisors should help youth peers identify long-term professional goals as well as action steps on how to achieve them. Like Caitlin said, youth peers can't be peers forever, since we should be near peers to the young people we're working with. So that usually, tends to go up to age 30 or so. And it's important that we support the youth peer support specialists we're working with to feel like they have a plan for what they're going to do next, because I think that can really contribute to a feeling of burnout if you just don't know what's going to happen after you leave your job. So it's important to think about ways that you can support youth peer support specialists with planning for their future. And that could include assisting with education, extracurricular learning, leadership development, etc.
Something that I think that's important to highlight as well is that I've spoken with a lot of people who have youth peers and adult peers in their agency, and the assumption that they make is that youth peers can just go on to be adult peers. But the reality is that some youth peers might not have the same lived experience that transfers into their quote-unquote adult life. And additionally, maybe they don't want to stay within the peer workforce, and that's important to acknowledge. So I really encourage you to think about ways that you can avoid some of that tokenization of youth peers just moving on to become adult peers or family peers, especially since their lived experience might not exactly match with such. Okay, so now we're going to get into coaching. And your question might be right now, well, what's the difference between coaching and supervision? Well, supervision is much more of that piece on how are you supporting the youth in their role within your agency and helping them hold accountable to what they're supposed to be doing. And coaching is really about providing those opportunities for a youth peer support to learn and grow and also focus on maybe some specific aspects of their role that they might need extra assistance on. And what I like to think about coaching is this is an opportunity really for the young adult peer and their supervisor to learn together about some topics, not necessarily one being an expert over the other. So you want to keep in mind that in order to effectively coach youth peer support specialists, it's important for supervisors to understand the uniqueness of the youth peer role in supporting young people and how this role is integrated into the care team or the agency. So something that we know is really different about youth peer support roles is that there's a certain level of mutuality between the youth peer support and the youth. The youth peer support is not there to be any kind of a disciplinarian or behavior modifier for the young adults that they're working with, and they're actively using their lived experience in order to support youth advocacy and help professionals understand where young people are coming from. So with that in mind, we want to be really, really mindful of how we're integrating this coaching and the reason that their relationship is going to look different with the young people that they work with, the parents that they're working with, and the other professionals that they're working with as well. So here are a few areas of things that a youth peer support might need some extra coaching on. So youth peer support specialists do things like normalize, destigmatize, help build rapport, hope, and trust for a young person. They're going to be sharing their lived experiences both with young people and with team members. They're going to help the youth advocate and the youth navigate, as well as advocate at a systems level. So a big part of the youth peer support role is not just helping young people navigate the systems, but helping to work to destigmatize and change the systems as well. So there's a lot here, right? There's also some things that youth peer supports are frequently asked to do, but really shouldn't. So things like providing administrative support, being seen as a therapist or a skills trainer, being the chauffeur or the taxi. While youth peer supports should be able to drive young people, I think it's important that we're not expecting them to drive them to every meeting or things like that, because in the long run, that's not supporting the young person, right? What happens when they stop working together? They're not there also to be a friend. A common misconception that I saw as a youth peer support specialist is people would often say to me, like, well, aren't you just going and getting froyo? And not that froyo isn't very important, but you're not there to just be a friend to the young person. You're also a mandatory reporter. You're there to help support them in making goals and decisions for their life. You guys aren't necessarily just kicking it all the time. They're not there to babysit or provide supervision for the youth. They're also not there to tell the youth what to do or to give them advice necessarily. They're there to help listen to the youth, help the youth build their own ideas and goals, and then use maybe some of their lived experience to help the youth feel normalized in their situation. They're also not there to speak for the youth. Now, the youth may ask for their help in speaking on certain topics, but really they're there to help the young person advocate for themselves. So with a lot of topics, it's important that there's continued coaching and checking in because some of these things are going to change over time. Some of these topics are going to include things like setting boundaries, staffing specific youth needs, communicating effectively with system and community partners, and we really can't hit this one home enough, but self-care. A lot of people come into this role, I know that I certainly did, not really recognizing that I needed routine good self-care. And I consistently thought that self-care meant, eating chocolate cake in the bath or whatever, not necessarily that I'm going to bed at the same time every night or that I'm making sure that I'm eating healthy meals, things of that nature. Not that I don't support eating cake in the bath, but that's not necessarily routine self-care, right? So some recommendations that we have for coaching. So one thing that we need to recognize is that many youth peers are isolated within their agency. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't have agency partners or friends or, go to lunch with people. We're not saying that youth peers are like stuck in a corner somewhere, but a lot of the times youth peers are the only young adult peer working within their agency, Or maybe they have one other, but they're doing a lot of community-based work and don't necessarily get to connect together all of the time. It's really vital that they're able to connect with other youth peer support specialists who understand what it's like to work in that role. This will do a couple of things. Number one, it'll help prevent burnout. It will help prevent sort of some of the role confusion that happens. We have found through some studies that we've conducted here at the Pathways Research and Training Center that a lot of youth and young adult peers feel like there's some conflict within their agency about what they're supposed to be doing and then what the youth wants them to do, and there's a lot of role confusion. So the more that they're able to connect with other youth and young adult peers, the less we are finding some of that quote-unquote role bleeding happening. It's also very helpful that youth peers are coached by other peer support specialists with lived experience who understand the role. So naturally, somebody who's done the role before is going to be able to coach on specific topics a little bit more adequately than somebody who hasn't conducted the role. I've seen in a number of agencies we have young adult peer support specialists coaching each other. There's also group coaching for youth peer support specialists and family peer support specialists. Obviously, these roles are going to look different, but I think that the more that you have a peer community that gets to receive coaching from other peers, the more helpful it is in their role. And then youth peers should receive individual and group coaching. I think it's really important that you're working on individual goals with people that are specific to their needs. I'll reference back to the learning practice agreement that we looked at earlier where it talks about setting individual goals. However, group coaching can be really valuable because then everybody not only is learning together, but learning from each other. So, bringing it back around to group coaching for youth peers, this fine group over here does host monthly communities of practice. Ta-da! So, I bet that you were all wondering, how are we going to get coaching for our youth peers? Well, you can get it right here. So we have monthly opportunities for youth peers to learn and connect with one another. We have a group for advanced peers. We're starting one for new youth peers, so people who are new to the role, and for supervisors of youth peers. We cover topics like self-care, again, you're going to hear that word a lot more, youth-driven practice, how to share your story, and professional communication. What we've heard from the youth peers that we're currently serving through these communities of practice is that the most valuable thing to them is being able to connect with other youth peers and get some validation in their role. They also get to identify what topics they would like further coaching on, so it's a really individualized process for the group. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, please feel free to get in touch with us after the webinar, and we'll send out some information in our follow-up as well.
All right, so this next part is about self-care and creating a culture of self-care for youth peer support specialists within the agency. So, creating a culture of self-care. As a supervisor, you can help with creating this culture by modeling good practices, being proactive in guarding against compassion fatigue and burnout, making self-care a regular part of supervision and coaching conversations, and creating a self-care plan. Also addressing vicarious trauma and burnout when it happens. When you're modeling self-care, you can do this by maintaining appropriate boundaries around workload, client, staff, and work life. That's both for yourself and helping the peers that you are supervising kind of build that themselves as well. Taking time off. Caitlin mentioned this earlier about when you're taking a mental health day, being clear about the fact that it is a mental health day. It kind of normalizes that of mental health is important to address and makes it normalized so that other people, specifically peers, can take that and feel comfortable saying that as well. You also want to limit emails after hours and on the weekends, and use your vacation time and normalize peers using their vacation time as well. Also, building self-care and support discussions into team meetings. So you don't want it to be kind of quiet about it. You don't want it to like having self-care be like loud and proud and support stuff as well is really important.
I think additionally, it's really important to kind of check in as a team about these things, and some examples that we can use. So we do a little game, I guess, called News and Goods. Maria's much better at explaining it, so if I totally fumble, she'll step in for me. But basically, we start meetings where we talk about what's something new that's in our lives, and then what's something good that's in our lives. And it gives everybody sort of an opportunity to check in a trauma-informed way. Additionally, I really want to highlight that limiting emails after hours and on the weekends. I know that I have worked for agencies in the past where there was definitely some, I think, culture of productivity, let's call it. And they expected that you were going to answer emails on the weekends, that you were working all the time. And there was a little bit of a shame factor associated with not doing that, even though they touted self-care as a value. So you really want to make sure that you're not just saying these things. We're not tokenizing self-care. It's really something that you are displaying for your staff. Because if you as a supervisor aren't doing it, what are your staff going to expect? That they're going to be penalized if they don't do it as well. So really keep that in mind. I know for some of us it's really hard to turn off, quote unquote, the job, but I think that that's important in order to avoid burnout in yourself and in your staff members.
Well, and I think building on that part of limiting emails after hours, also normalizing ignoring emails, even if you do look at your email on the weekends, like ignore it until Monday. You did not see it, because that's a good first step for building that, like, or breaking the habit of checking emails and sending emails after work and on the weekends.
Absolutely.
So when you're being proactive, talk with youth peer support specialists when you begin supervising them to identify possible signs of stress and burnout, and get permission to check in if you notice any of what they say are signs of stress and burnout. When you notice them, start a conversation, something along the lines of, I've noticed you seem really tired lately, and I remember we talked about that being a sign of burnout for you. How are you doing? If the staff is feeling burnt out, then that's a good time to work on a self-care plan. Or if they already have a self-care plan, review it or beef it up, kind of make it more tailored to the time that they're going through right now.
And you want to make sure that those are individualized. I know that when I was a supervisor, there were some staff where I could just tell them, like, go home, you're taking the day off. And then I knew that there were some staff where if I told them to do that, they weren't going to do that. So we had to check in about what activity were they going to do later for self-care. So keeping that in mind as well. Even though I wanted to give everybody the day off all the time.
So more parts of being proactive, keep supervision and coaching sessions regular and frequent. It's really easy to get wrapped up in the crises that are going on in a lot of, because peer work involves a lot of that, and I think working with youth in the mental health system in general involves a lot of that. So it's easy to be like, oh, just this week I need to meet with somebody else, and try to avoid that as much as possible. I know that's kind of easier said than done, but having that regular supervision, that regular coaching really helps for preventing burnout. Be sure when you're doing that to include time to debrief immediately after any crisis or higher intensity incidents, as well as continued support and checking in as needed. So as Caitlin said, this might include time off for self-care, depending on what the youth peer support specialist needs. If possible, provide opportunities for youth peer support specialists to connect with other peers. Again, another plug, our community of practice is a good place for that kind of beginning, but also you want to build that in more regularly.
Shameless plugs.
Okay, so self-care and supervision. So when you're supervising youth peers, make it a part of every supervision to include a discussion or question about how's your workload? Are you feeling burnt out? What are you doing for self-care? Every time you're meeting for supervision or coaching. and support your youth peer support specialist to identify what would be helpful in addressing any stress or burnout they are experiencing. So this could include adjusting their workload or adjusting, who they're supporting on their caseload possibly, support from other staff. I know something I used to do with my staff at a previous agency I worked with was something that can be expected of youth peer support specialists is to kind of be on call 24/7 for their youth, especially those who might be, prone to experiencing crisis and dependent on their youth peer support specialists for support. So we would have certain weekends where the staff could put their phones on call forwarding to forward to another youth peer support specialist, and they would talk to their youth ahead of time and let them know, hey, I'm going to be turning off my phone for self-care, but if you call, you're going to be able to talk to so-and-so, probably someone they might have met before. But that was a really good way for people to be able to actually feel like they had a weekend off or time off where they could, be free from those responsibilities. And then using sick time or schedule flexing if they really need, to take some time off for mental health. And then talking about, things they can do on their own. And I think when you have a culture of self-care, that really promotes people kind of learning different self-care tips from each other. Like, you're going to therapy or you're doing jogging or whatever it may be, I think people can really learn from each other from what their coworkers are doing.
Absolutely. And I think that something that's important to keep in mind as well is when we do this, it's good modeling for the young people that we work with too.
Absolutely.
So for instance, I know that with the call forwarding, it's like that would be a good example of showing young people too that it's important for them to take care of themselves and take a break when they need to. So keep that in mind as you are helping to coach on some of the self-care and using self-care within your supervision is what are some of these things that our youth peer support specialists can model for our young people?
Okay, so when you're creating a self-care plan, either proactively or in reaction to a youth peer support specialist experiencing burnout or fatigue, some questions you might want to ask are, what do you enjoy doing? What does a healthy routine look like for you? What does wellness look like for you? Who's a support for you? Who do you go to when you need support? How do you like to relax? And can I check in with you about self-care? And I'm going to be checking in with you about self-care if you're me.
Yeah, and normalizing checking in about self-care. And I think something that we really want to cover is that this isn't just when you're noticing that staff might need some self-care. It's important to do this on a regular basis. So I know for me, whenever I saw my staff at the agency that I worked at previously, one of my first questions would be, what are you doing for self-care this weekend? And it kind of became a joke. Like I ended up having to sort of hide it in a way because people would just roll their eyes at me after a while. But I think it's important that you're making it a regular, normalized thing to check in on. Otherwise, I don't know that people are really going to be held accountable to it. It's also important that when people answer the question, so if somebody says, oh, I'm going on a hike this weekend, that maybe when you see them the next time you ask them, how was that hike that you went on? I think it's also really important as we're doing these check-ins for self-care, that we're kind of coaching on what self-care is. So again, it's not just cake in the bath, right? It is making sure that you're getting enough sleep, that it's making sure that you are being able to eat on a regular basis, or exercise or treat your body in a way that feels good for you. Things like that maybe are some of the, they feel like chores, but we know that they help us maintain good mental health and help us maintain the work.
So this next part's about vicarious trauma and recognizing and addressing vicarious trauma and burnout. So vicarious trauma is the emotional residue of exposure that workers have from working with people as they are hearing their trauma stories and become witnesses to the pain, fear, and terror that trauma survivors have endured. It is important not to confuse vicarious trauma with burnout. Some common signs of vicarious trauma include lack of sleep, poor eating habits, feeling jumpy or panicky, constant worry, lack of enjoyment or calm, having intrusive thoughts about clients, feelings of hopelessness or lack of self-worth. So this can look like anything from eating cake in a bath every day, or sorry, I just really
love
like
that example. Yeah.
Or suddenly you're not eating as much as you want to be, and you are feeling hungry, but you can't really just, your stomach also hurts too much to eat, kind of a thing. Or in the middle of the night, you like wake up in a panic, like, shoot, I need to like talk to so-and-so's caseworker, kind of a thing. And like that kind of, when it's getting in the way of your outside of work time, it's important to recognize that.
It's also going to be important to recognize that a lot of the youth peers coming into this role aren't going to be familiar with what vicarious trauma is. So I really encourage you in your orientation practices to start training on that early so that people can recognize when they're feeling it within themselves. I know that the first time I experienced vicarious trauma was after responding to a school shooting, and I really didn't think, I thought I was fine. I was like, whatever, it's normal that people watch Parks and Rec over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? And then I went to a training and kind of had a coaching with some of my other peers, and I was like, oh, no, I'm doing some weird stuff and should probably be talking about this with my therapist. So a lot of the times people aren't going to see it within themselves. So it's really important, again, that you start training and coaching on this kind of early, and that it's normalized within your supervision practices to check in about.
Well, because it's very big that, like, you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So helping youth peer support specialists know what to look for is a very good thing.
Absolutely.
So burnout is physical, emotional, and or mental exhaustion relating to ongoing stress or frustration. Something that I've heard a lot about burnout is it's not if, it's when. So really trying to employ self-care practices before really helps that when it does happen, because this is intense shit that we do every day. But it's intense. So recognizing that it will come up will help that when it does, you kind of have a plan.
Absolutely.
So common signs of burnout include lack of motivation, disengagement, having a short emotional fuse, exhaustion, and sense of helplessness. So that short emotional fuse isn't necessarily like you're angry at the drop of a hat, which it totally could be that, but it might be like suddenly you're crying for no reason and you don't quite know what's going on with that, or all of a sudden you're like laughing and you don't know what you're laughing about or how to stop, like that kind of a thing where like you're kind of popping off on emotions and not sure where they're coming from.
It might also just be related to that disengagement and sort of dissociation too. I am not going to lie, when I was a supervisor for youth peers, there were just some times when I was really overwhelmed and people would come to me with issue that they wanted some assistance with, and a common phrase that I would throw at them was, oh, come on, you're fine. And again, it became a bit of a joke, but I mean, they weren't. They were coming because they needed some support, right? But it wasn't that I was frustrated or traumatized by them asking for the support. It was just that I myself couldn't take on one more task necessarily. So when you see that happening with folks, if, they are shirking some of their responsibilities, if people are telling you things like, I can't take on anymore, that is super important to check in about. You want to make sure that burnout, again, is one of those consistent discussions that you're having with your staff, because they might not know what it is. So it's really important that you are being really transparent about what is to be expected in this role. As Mary Beth mentioned earlier, with burnout especially, it's not an if, but it's a when. So this is a difficult role. Youth peers are often working with young adults in response to crisis and other really serious situations. And a lot of these situations might relate to some of the experiences that they have had. I know that for myself, I was working with a lot of young people who were experiencing a lot of suicidality. And so that could be triggering to me because that was very similar to what I was experiencing when I was their age. So it's important to have conversations with our youth peer staff from the start about potential triggering or troubling situations. And I would encourage you to ask them, what are some fears that you have about this job? And what are some things that you think you might be triggered by? Something that you might hear, I know that I heard this from staff, was, I don't have any triggers. You don't want to call people out on that, but that's not a thing. Like, that's not true. So it's okay to ask them if you get that answer to say something like, okay, well, if I'm noticing that you're acting like you're maybe triggered by something or something difficult comes up, is it okay if I check in with you about that? And again, that can be a really important coaching moment. So as mentioned in the self-care section, you want to talk with staff about signs of burnout that you should be looking for to prompt them to enact on their self-care plan. So we included some common signs of burnout, but there can be other ones that people have that they know are unique to them. I had a staff member one time who was telling me that I would know she was burnt out if she wasn't wearing any makeup. And I was like, that's really interesting. And then sure enough, there was like a week where she showed up without makeup, and I knew that that was my sign to be like, hey girl, what's going on? So be sure to check in with your staff about what you think their common signs of burnout might be. So in terms of addressing vicarious trauma and burnout, especially before it's quote unquote, and if you could see me, you'd see that I have air quotes going here, but like too late, make sure that you're reviewing the self-care plan and checking in about such the following day. Make it a habit to ask, what are you doing for self-care? And that check-in is really important for accountability. So if again, you're asking somebody, what are you doing for self-care? And they say, I'm going to go on a hike. Check in with them, shoot them a text or something the next day, and be like, oh, tell me how your hike was. Saw some great pictures on Instagram. Yay! Review and reflect on what your staff has acknowledged as their triggers and signs of burnout. And I would encourage you, too, that if you're noticing signs of burnout or vicarious trauma in them that they might not be noticing themselves, that's okay to reflect on as well. Create a specific work plan that outlines what tasks they need a break from, and working back up to said tasks if necessary. So sometimes there are really specific things that can be triggering for people, and it's important to check in about that and see, is this something that they need to be doing within their role? And if it is, how are we working back up to that? So for instance, if you're working with a youth peer support specialist who's saying, well, I'm very triggered by working with youth, that's probably not going to work, right? But if they're saying it's really problematic for me to sit in a meeting for 2 hours with a bunch of people, talk to them about maybe can they attend by Skype, what are some of the other accommodations that we can make in order for them to complete their work. And then when necessary, suggest that staff take time off. Ensure that your agency has special accommodations that don't affect staff pay. So if we're telling staff to take time off, but we're eating into their pay, they're not going to get paid that day, that can be problematic, right? And that can actually contribute to burnout. So make sure that you have accommodations like mental health days that staff can access in order to address what it is that they're going through.
Can I add on that real quick?
Of course.
So we talked about burnout being a when, not if kind of thing, but I also want to recognize that burnout doesn't have to happen all the time, and it doesn't have to be a career ender. So a lot of this is about trying to prevent burnout as much as possible, but also being able to address it when it happens. And it's the same with vicarious trauma. So I think it's also really important to normalize checking in about burnout if you're seeing it, kind of a thing. Or it doesn't need to be some kind of like secret, like, oh,
yeah,
so-and-so's going through burnout right now, and so, kind of a thing. Like, address it and recognize it for what it is, and that is just kind of a moment to pause and work on it, and then come back, You can come back from burnout.
And it doesn't have to be a big, scary question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that a part of that is that transparency about the role of like, hey, this is going to happen. This is how we're going to check in about it. This is how we can support you. And then this is how we're going to come back from it. So we have some recommendations and some resources for just making sure that your agency is set up to support not just youth peers, but anybody who's doing this kind of difficult work. So having some access to counseling services. So a lot of agencies will have sort of like counseling services on retainer where you can access 10 free hours of counseling if you're experiencing something within your workplace. Making sure that they have peer groups outside of the workplace. So I think a lot of times what we see contributing to burnout or vicarious trauma is that people who work together are also together all the time. And so making sure that they have other access to other folks. Again, a scaled down work plan or a really specific work plan that is focused on what sorts of tasks are they taking a break from and what are they building back up to. And again, regular check-ins. So making sure that those are a priority for you as a supervisor and that they're really normalized for your youth peer support staff. So we're about to wrap up here, and I see that we have a question or two. I just want to really quick make sure that we are reviewing our contact info. So if you have any questions about the MHTTC, the Mental Health Technology Transfer Network Program, this is where you can email them, call them, or access the website. You can also join the newsletter, and there is a sign-up link in the chat box for you all that will regularly update you on trainings and resources. And then additionally, we recommend that you access our site, the Pathways Research and Training Center. There's lots of really cool products and lots of webinars and published papers and different kinds of trainings that you can access that are related to youth and young adult mental health and peer support. We also are the purveyors of the Achieve My Plan intervention. This is an actual evidence-based intervention for using youth-driven techniques and conversational skills for young people who have serious mental health conditions. And we have a specific training for youth peer support specialists that's done by youth peer support specialists to help them not only work with youth in a youth-driven way, but kind of clarify their role for them and prevent some of that role bleeding that we were talking about earlier. Then we also have the website where you can access the MHTTC trainings. So here you will find information about the communities of practice that we were talking about, as well as upcoming webinars across the region. And again, we have the MHTTC newsletter that you all can sign up for to get regular updates. So it looks like we have a question here about the communities of practice. So how are the communities of practice funded, and is there a cost to agencies? There is no cost to agencies. So the communities of practice are entirely free. They are intended to serve youth peer support specialists and their supervisors in what is known as Region 10. So that is the states of Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. That said, we have had other participants come in from other states. I encourage you, if you have questions about that, please go ahead and send me an email. I will send you my email in the chat box here, or you can reach us out of any of the other ways. And I don't know where the chat box just went. Oh, there it is. So yes, they are free. They're monthly. They're about an hour. And right now we have 11 participants in one of them. So it's a pretty great resource. Are there any other questions that folks have? Okay, great. Well, in that case, we'll wrap up a little early. Enjoy the extra 10 minutes that you all have in your day, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.